European-style living room and bedroom. How to create a timeless, elegant and luxurious European home. Have you ever walked into a European-style home and immediately felt that it looked expensive, even though you couldn't quite understand why? Maybe there was a beautifully detailed wall, a simple linen sofa, an elegant chandelier, natural wood flooring and a few carefully chosen accessories. Nothing seemed excessive, and yet everything looked incredibly refined. This is one of the most interesting things about European interiors. They don't always rely on dramatic colors, oversized furniture or an abundance of decoration to create luxury. Instead, they create beauty through proportion, architecture, materials, texture, lighting and restraint. And that is exactly what we're going to explore in today's video. We're going to take a complete journey through a European-style home, starting with the living room and then moving into the bedroom. We'll look at everything from European wall paneling and architectural moldings to flooring, furniture, natural materials, color palettes, curtains, chandeliers, wall sconces, artwork, mirrors and styling. But rather than simply telling you what to buy, we're going to understand why these elements work together, because that is what will actually help you create the look in your own home. And there is one important thing to remember before we begin. European style is not one fixed design style. Parisian, Italian, Mediterranean, English and contemporary European interiors can look completely different from one another, but they often share the same underlying philosophy. They respect architecture, they value natural materials, they pay attention to proportion, and they understand that a room doesn't need to be filled with things to feel complete. Let's start with the living room, because this is where the European design language can become particularly powerful. Imagine walking into an empty living room. There is no sofa, no coffee table, no artwork and no accessories. Before you add anything, look carefully at the room itself. Look at the ceiling height, the windows, the doors, the wall widths, the natural light and the relationship between all of these elements. This is the architectural shell of the room, and it is incredibly important because the furniture and decoration should eventually work with this architecture rather than fight against it. This is one of the biggest differences between simply decorating a room and actually designing one. One of the easiest ways to give an ordinary room more architectural character is through wall detailing. This is where European wall paneling becomes so effective. Imagine a completely plain wall painted in a warm ivory color. It may look perfectly finished, but visually it can still feel flat. Now introduce a series of simple rectangular moldings. Suddenly the wall has rhythm. The light creates subtle shadows. The furniture has something to relate to, and the entire room begins to feel more architectural. But there is an important distinction here. European paneling isn't simply about putting decorative strips onto a wall. It is about creating a carefully proportioned composition that belongs to the room. For example, if your living room has very high ceilings, you may be able to use taller and larger panels without making the wall feel crowded. If the ceiling is lower, smaller and more restrained detailing may work better. Similarly, a very wide wall needs a different panel rhythm from a narrow wall. Doors, windows, electrical points, switches, fireplaces and furniture placement also need to be considered before finalizing the design. This is why copying a beautiful paneling design from a photograph isn't always the best approach. The photograph was created for a completely different room, with different proportions and different architectural conditions. Take inspiration from the reference, but allow your own room to determine the final design. And here's something else that is incredibly important. You don't have to panel every wall. In fact, one beautifully designed paneled wall can often have more impact than 4 heavily decorated walls. Perhaps the main sofa wall receives the architectural treatment while another wall is kept relatively quiet and receives artwork. Maybe the fireplace wall becomes the focal point while the remaining surfaces are simpler. This creates hierarchy, and hierarchy is essential because the eye needs to understand where to look first. If every wall is trying to be the star of the room can quickly become visually tiring. The material used for the paneling also deserves attention. Depending on the design and application, MDF, timber, plywood, gypsum-based detailing or other architectural systems can be used. But the material itself isn't the only thing that determines whether the finished wall looks luxurious. Installation and finishing are just as important. A beautifully designed molding can still look inexpensive if the joints are visible, the corners aren't aligned properly, or the paint finish is uneven. On the other hand, a relatively simple molding profile can look extremely sophisticated when it has been installed with precision and finished beautifully. This is something we often see in high-end interiors. Luxury is frequently found in the quality of the execution rather than in how complicated the design looks. Once the architecture has been established, we can start talking about color. European interiors are often associated with white, but that doesn't necessarily mean a cold, bright white. Warm whites, ivory, cream, soft stone, taupe and greige can create a much more sophisticated atmosphere. These colors allow the shadows created by molding and architectural details to remain visible without making the room feel too dramatic. If you want something more expressive, muted greens, dusty blues, warm browns and soft terracotta can also work beautifully. The important thing is that the colors shouldn't compete with one another. European interiors often use a restrained palette where several slightly different tones work together to create depth. And this brings us to another major principle: texture. If you use the same smooth finish everywhere, even a beautiful neutral palette can feel flat. This is why European interiors often combine different tactile materials. Imagine a warm plaster-toned wall, a linen sofa, natural oak flooring, a wool rug, a stone coffee table and aged brass lighting. There may not be much color variation, but there is enormous material variation. Your eye moves from the grain of the timber to the softness of the linen, from the texture of the rug to the natural variation in the stone. This is what allows a neutral interior to feel rich rather than boring. The flooring is particularly important because it is one of the largest surfaces in the room. Natural timber can immediately introduce warmth and character. Oak is particularly versatile because it can work beautifully with both traditional and contemporary furniture. Straight planks can create a cleaner, more modern feeling, while herringbone flooring introduces a more traditional European character. Chevron flooring can feel slightly more dramatic and formal. Stone, marble, limestone-inspired surfaces and travertine can create a completely different mood, particularly if you're moving towards a more Italian or Mediterranean interpretation of European style. But always think about balance. If your floor has a strong pattern, perhaps the wall should be quieter. If your wall has elaborate paneling, a calmer floor may allow the architecture to stand out. Now let's bring in one of the most important pieces of furniture in the living room, the sofa. And before choosing the color, look at the shape. Is it curved or straight? Is it deep and relaxed or more structured? Does it have a traditional silhouette or a contemporary profile? The shape of the sofa determines a huge part of the personality of the room. A curved sofa can soften a room filled with architectural lines. A tailored sofa can reinforce a clean contemporary European aesthetic. A classic silhouette can work beautifully with traditional moldings, while a relaxed linen sofa can make the room feel more casual and natural. And you don't necessarily have to choose between classic and contemporary. In fact, one of the most beautiful European interiors is often created by deliberately mixing the two. Imagine traditional wall moldings, an old-style fireplace and herringbone flooring combined with a very modern curved sofa and sculptural coffee table. The architecture provides history, while the furniture makes the space feel current. This combination prevents the room from looking like a historical recreation or a showroom. It feels like a real home that has evolved over time. The same principle applies to the coffee table. Natural stone, marble, travertine, timber or even glass can work beautifully, depending on the overall composition. But don't choose a coffee table simply because you like the material. Consider its shape and scale in relation to the sofa and the rest of the room. If most of the furniture has sharp rectangular lines, a rounded coffee table can introduce softness. If the room already has many curved forms, a more structured table can provide contrast. Good design is often about creating these small conversations between different shapes. The rug plays a similar role. It can visually connect the sofa, chairs and coffee tables so that they feel like one seating arrangement rather than separate objects. Natural wool, muted patterns and vintage-inspired designs can work beautifully in European interiors because they provide texture without overwhelming the room. And again, size matters. A rug that is too small can make the furniture appear disconnected, while a properly scaled rug can make the entire room feel more grounded. Now, once all of the major elements are in place, we finally reach styling. And this is where restraint becomes extremely important. You don't need to fill every shelf, every table and every corner. Instead, create small compositions. A few books, a ceramic vase, a sculptural object, a branch, a candle holder or a small floral arrangement may be enough. Vary the height, shape and texture of your objects, but always leave some breathing room. Empty space is not unfinished space. It allows the objects you have selected to actually be appreciated. Now let's move into the bedroom, because although many of the same European principles continue, the atmosphere should change completely. The living room is social. The bedroom is personal. The living room can handle stronger contrast and more dramatic furniture, while the bedroom should usually feel quieter, softer and more intimate. The materials become more tactile, the colors become calmer and the lighting becomes warmer. The wall behind the bed is usually the natural focal point, so this is a wonderful place to introduce European architectural detailing. You might use simple rectangular molding, subtle paneling, a textured plaster-like finish or even a beautifully colored wall. The key is to make the wall and the bed feel like one composition. Instead of simply placing a bed against a wall, think about how the headboard, paneling, artwork, bedside tables and lighting can all work together. The flooring can continue the warmth of the living room, particularly if you're using timber. Then introduce softness through a properly scaled rug. A large rug underneath the bed can anchor the entire composition, while smaller rugs beside the bed can create a lighter feeling. Again, scale matters because a rug that is too small can make the furniture appear disconnected. Bedside tables can be symmetrical for a classic European appearance, but they don't necessarily have to match exactly. Two different pieces can create a more collected, relaxed feeling as long as they have similar visual weight. Wall sconces can be particularly effective here because they free the bedside table and create a clean, elegant appearance. And lighting in the bedroom should be even more carefully layered than in the living room. A central decorative fixture can create a beautiful focal point, while bedside sconces provide practical reading light. Table lamps, accent lights and concealed lighting can add further layers. Imagine switching off the central light at night and leaving only the bedside sconces glowing. The entire room immediately becomes softer and more intimate. Curtains continue that feeling. Floor-to-ceiling fabric makes the room feel taller and softer, while sheer curtains can filter daylight beautifully. Heavier drapes can provide privacy and warmth. They don't have to match the bedding exactly. Instead, think about whether they belong to the same color and material story. Artwork in the bedroom can also be softer and more personal. A landscape, abstract, portrait or photograph can work beautifully above the bed. The key is to consider scale and visual weight. One large piece can sometimes be much more effective than several small pieces competing with one another. And finally, styling. The bedroom doesn't need to be filled with accessories. A small vase, a book, a candle, a tray or a personal object can be enough. The goal is to make the room feel peaceful rather than visually busy. European interiors often have this wonderful quality where they feel collected rather than staged. They look as though the objects have been gathered over time rather than purchased all at once from the same catalogue. And that brings us to one of the most important principles of the entire design, mixing old and new. If you are worried that European style might look too traditional, this is your solution. Combine classic architectural elements with contemporary furniture. Use traditional molding with modern artwork. Pair herringbone flooring with a sculptural sofa. Combine an antique-inspired mirror with contemporary lighting. Use classic architectural detailing behind a modern upholstered headboard. The contrast creates character, and perhaps more importantly, it gives the home longevity. A room that is completely based on one historical style can sometimes feel dated when trends change. But a room that combines different influences can feel much more timeless. Now let's talk about the mistakes, because this is where many European-inspired interiors go wrong. The first mistake is overusing paneling. Paneling is beautiful, but it should be used with intention. The second mistake is ignoring scale. Even the most beautiful sofa, chandelier or artwork can look wrong if it is too large or too small for the room. The third mistake is using too many metallic finishes. Aged brass can be incredibly elegant, but if every element is shiny gold, the room can quickly become excessive. The fourth mistake is introducing too many materials without a clear hierarchy. Marble, glass, velvet, glossy finishes, gold, timber, stone and mirror can all be beautiful individually, but together they can create visual noise. Another common mistake is matching everything. European interiors usually coordinate rather than perfectly match. Your sofa doesn't need to match the curtains. Your bedside tables don't have to match the headboard. Your artwork doesn't need to match the rug. What matters is that they belong to the same overall story. And perhaps the biggest mistake of all is trying too hard to make the room look European. This may sound strange, but it is extremely important. If you add moldings, chandeliers, vintage mirrors, herringbone flooring, brass details, traditional furniture, ornate accessories and decorative artwork all at once simply because they are European, the room can quickly become a collection of references rather than a sophisticated interior. Instead, take the principles. Use proportion, use texture, use natural materials, respect the architecture, layer the lighting, mix classic and contemporary elements. And most importantly, because sometimes the most European thing you can do is simply leave something out. So if you're designing a European-style living room and bedroom, remember these principles. Begin with architecture, understand your proportions, use paneling strategically, choose materials that age beautifully, introduce texture, select furniture based on scale and shape, layer your lighting, use curtains to soften the architecture, choose artwork that gives the home personality and style with restraint. But above everything else, remember that your home should still feel like your home. European design isn't about recreating someone else's photograph. It is about understanding why that photograph feels beautiful. When you see a European living room, look at the proportions rather than simply the furniture. Look at how the wall detailing relates to the ceiling. Look at the relationship between the sofa and coffee table. Look at how the natural light enters the room. Look at how the curtains fall. Look at the texture of the materials. Look at what has deliberately been left empty. And when you look at a European bedroom, look at the relationship between the headboard, wall, bedside tables, lighting and bedding. Ask yourself why the room feels calm. Why does it feel warm? Why does it feel luxurious without looking excessive? Once you understand these relationships, you don't have to copy anyone. You can create your own version. And that is where interior design becomes much more exciting. Because the ultimate goal isn't to create a room that simply looks beautiful in a photograph. The ultimate goal is to create a room that feels beautiful when you actually live in it. A living room where you genuinely want to sit. A bedroom where you genuinely want to rest. A home where the materials become more beautiful as they age. A space where the lighting changes with the time of day. A home where the architecture has personality but doesn't overpower you. And a space where every object has enough room to be appreciated. That is what timeless design should do. Now let's talk about one of the most important elements in the entire design: lighting. Imagine your living room during the afternoon. Natural light is coming through the windows, the timber floor is catching the sunlight, the moldings are creating soft shadows and everything looks beautiful. Now imagine the same room at night. If you switch on one extremely bright ceiling light, the entire atmosphere changes. This is why European interiors benefit so much from layered lighting. You can have a decorative chandelier, wall sconces, floor lamps, table lamps and accent lighting, each contributing a different level of illumination. A chandelier can become the jewelry of the room, but it doesn't have to be enormous. A delicate crystal fixture can reinforce a classic aesthetic, while aged brass can add warmth. Opal glass can feel softer and more contemporary, while a sculptural modern fixture can create an interesting contrast against traditional architecture. The important thing is scale. The chandelier should belong to the room rather than simply being a beautiful object suspended in it. Wall sconces are particularly effective when used alongside European architectural details. Imagine two elegant sconces framing a fireplace, artwork, or mirror. During the day, they may simply look decorative. At night, they become sources of warm light that reveal the molding and create beautiful shadows across the wall. This is why lighting should ideally be considered at the architectural planning stage rather than being treated as something added at the end. The curtains then soften everything. Floor-to-ceiling curtains can visually increase the height of the room and create a more elegant appearance. Linen and linen blend fabrics are particularly effective because they introduce natural texture and movement. Warm ivory, cream and taupe are timeless choices, but you can also introduce muted colors if the rest of the room is restrained. The important thing is that the curtain fabric has enough fullness to create beautiful folds rather than looking completely flat. And then comes artwork, which is where the room begins to develop personality. European interiors don't have to use only traditional paintings. You can combine classic landscapes with contemporary abstracts, photography with vintage-inspired pieces, or even modern sculpture with traditional architecture. In fact, this contrast can make the room more interesting. What matters most is the scale and placement. A tiny piece of artwork floating above a large sofa can feel lost, while one large, beautifully positioned piece can anchor the entire composition. Mirrors are equally useful, particularly in European-inspired interiors. An antique-style mirror can add character. An arched mirror can soften the geometry of the room, and a large mirror can reflect light and make a space feel more open. But don't simply use a mirror to fill an empty wall. Think about what it will reflect. A mirror reflecting a chandelier, a beautiful artwork, or natural light becomes much more powerful because it contributes to the overall composition. Tell me your choices in the comments, because I would genuinely love to see how differently everyone approaches the same design challenge. And if you enjoyed today's video, stay connected with Everyday Interiors TV for more interior design inspiration, practical design ideas, beautiful materials, and ideas that can help you create a home that feels as good as it looks. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep designing spaces that aren't just beautiful to look at, but beautiful to live in.